Well, thank you everyone for joining us. It is a joy to be able to host this conversation. My name is Ben Norquist. I'm the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. And welcome to this really important conversation with some remarkable guests. I want to say thank you for our panelists for taking the time and giving us the gift of what they're going to share today. I also want to say thank you to each of you attending this webinar. In this busy world of ours, we really show what matters to us by what we spend our time on. And so the fact that you're spending time with us today is also a gift, and we want to say thank you for that. This session is being recorded. I just want to let you know that. It's going to be available to you and to anyone that you would like to share it with in the days and weeks to come. And throughout the conversation, the first half or so, I have some questions for our panelists. But when they're done with their remarks, there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So I want you thinking about those questions while they talk. You're welcome to start submitting your questions as they occur to you. You can use the Q&A function. Please don't use the comments, use the Q&A. That's the best place to put those. That's where we'll be looking for them. You should find a button at the bottom that says Q&A. You can click that and submit your question. Please make sure it's a question and not a comment. We want to honor our panelists' time with the kinds of questions that will help us to continue learning and having a good conversation today. What is the theme for our conversation? Here's an interesting question. What do Baptists who have deep personal ties to Palestine think about what the Southern Baptists said about Gaza this summer? How do they respond? I think it's a fascinating question, and one that we won't have to wait for too much longer to find out, because that's what this panel is. It's a panel of Baptists who have really interesting and unique relationships to Palestine. And they've thought deeply and carefully and lovingly and critically about what the Baptists have said this summer about what's happening in Gaza. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll start our conversation. Randy Tomlinson has served in a variety of teaching and servant leadership roles in several Presbyterian and Baptist churches in Minnesota and Tennessee. Most recently, he served as a deacon and lay pastor of the bicultural Arabic Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Randy currently serves as on the leadership team for the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, NEMI, as we say affectionately. So I work closely with him in NEMI. Hope has been an active member or regular attendee of Southern Baptist churches in 4 states over the last 25 plus years. During this time, she was also an SBC preacher's kid for over a decade and once represented her church as a messenger to the SBC annual meeting. She's married to a Palestinian believer and currently lives in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. So in other words, she's a Southern Baptist among Southern Baptists, and now she lives in the West Bank. Hope is going under an alias today and joining us from off camera. So you'll hear her voice, but you won't see her face. And that was intentional. This decision to protect Hope's identity has nothing to do with fear of Muslim neighbors. It is to protect against possible retaliation that would affect Hope's residency status in the West Bank, where she lives with her husband. And finally, Pastor Hannah Masad is the former pastor of the Gaza Baptist Church, the only evangelical church in Gaza. After being forced to leave Gaza, he organized a church in Amman, Jordan, that currently serves over 1,000 Iraqi and Syrian refugee families. He's founder and director of the Christian Mission to Gaza, one of only a few Christian ministries among nearly 2 million Muslims in one of the poorest and most densely populated places on earth, that is Gaza. Let's start our conversation. I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists the same question to respond to for a few minutes. Each of you have such unique backgrounds for this conversation. I wonder if you would tell us about yourself as a Southern Baptist with a relationship to Palestine. Let us get to know you a little bit and how you're approaching this conversation. We'll start with Randy and then move to Hope and Hannah.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. I think it's a critical topic, and hopefully one we can come to thoughtfully and with consideration for a variety of different views and so forth. But in answer to the question, my relationship with the Middle East, with Palestine, Israel particularly, began, guys, a little over 8 years ago on a journey that my wife and I took to Israel with Open Doors, who, if most know, is a ministry to the persecuted church around the world. And so we were introduced to the church in Israel, Palestine with that organization. And I went knowing nothing. Never been to Israel. It was always kind of on the bucket list, and thought, well, this is going to be the only time that we go, so let's make the most of it. And I remember the first Sunday morning that we were there in Bethlehem in an evangelical church. And my only exposure to Arab culture and to the Arabic language in particular had been if it was a news feed from Al Jazeera, that was being picked up on a domestic media. And so the Arabic language was not it didn't emanate safety and welcoming. It was always something associated with bad news. And so I remember that Sunday morning, my wife and I ended up in the front row of the church. And when the service started, we sat down, and the music, the lyrics were in Arabic, and the singing was in Arabic. And I remember sitting there and just saying, Lord, I want to worship this morning, but I'm just not comfortable here. And it was as palpable as anything I have ever experienced, that it was like someone put their hand on my shoulder and said, turn around. And I did. And behind me was 50, 60 Palestinians with their eyes closed, hands raised, and worshiping Yahshua al-Masih. And I just said, Lord, you have to change my heart. And the Lord answers prayers. And so from that time on, I've been very concerned, very, passionate about the church in the land, its current health and future prospects. And so I've been back to the region 4 times now, and currently planning some additional trips to hopefully do exactly that, strengthen what remains, as it says in Revelation 3:2. So that's a little bit on me.
Thanks, Randy. Hope, it's your turn.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to echo what's been said and thank all of you who are attending or watching the recording and are seeking to engage with this important topic. One of the most encouraging things in the past month since this iteration of the war began has been seeing people start to ask questions about things that they didn't know about before regarding the history and present conditions in the Holy Land. So the fact that you're listening and participating in this discussion means that you care, and hopefully that you want to learn. So thank you. And to answer Ben's question, I've spent pretty much my entire life being very involved in SBC churches. As he mentioned, over the last 30 years or so, I've been a member of different churches of vastly different sizes in different states, all within the SBC, and I was once a messenger to the annual meeting. So I'm familiar with the resolutions process, and I'm very familiar with the predominant view of the modern state of Israel among Southern Baptists. And I used to hold that view as far as thinking that there was absolutely no distinction between the Israelites in the Bible and the modern political state of Israel. I thought that Israel wasn't really capable of doing anything wrong, but if by some chance they did, that criticizing them in any way was setting myself up to be under God's wrath. Genesis 12:3 got thrown around a lot, where God tells Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And those words to Abraham, which incidentally were spoken to him before he had children, were applied to the modern state of Israel. So there was a lot of fear in saying or even thinking something that might be construed as negative about Israel. Now, when it came to Palestinians, there were no such qualms. From combining what I heard in churches and what I heard on the news, I fully equated Palestinians with terrorism. I had much the same experience that Randy just shared about with the Arabic language, and my exposure to that really centered around 9/11 and things that I heard on the news. And so, that was my only exposure to Arabic growing up. I thought that all Palestinians wanted Jewish people wiped off the face of the earth. I held the grossly oversimplified view, which is not really even biblical or accurate, that the entire conflict in the Holy Land boils down to, well, of course there's fighting because the descendants of Ishmael are always going to be jealous of and hate the descendants of Isaac. And honestly, I cringe saying those things now, but that's the mindset that I held for years. And in fact, it wasn't until I was in college that I even realized Palestinian Christians existed. A Palestinian believer came and spoke at my college and shared about his experience living in West Bank and the suffering he had endured at the hands of Israel. And it was like my whole world was totally shaken. First was the realization that in this people group that I thought were terrorists who just wanted to kill God's chosen people, there were actual believers in Jesus, which made them my brothers and sisters. And then I started thinking, okay, wait, wouldn't Jesus be upset that his followers are being treated this way? And if I'm thinking about allegiances I should have as a Christian, shouldn't my allegiance to my brothers and sisters in Christ, my family of faith, be stronger than my allegiance to a secular government and people who reject Christ and actually cause harm to his followers? So that moment was really pivotal for me in beginning the shift of how I thought about Palestinians. Of course, at the time, I still didn't understand much about the actual history of the Holy Land, especially in the last century, and I had no idea what day-to-day life was like there. But several years later, I met my husband, who was only the second Palestinian Christian I had ever known of by name, and the first that I came to know personally. And as I learned more and more about his life and traveled to meet his family in the Holy Land, which was my first time to ever be there, the process that had begun in college really accelerated. That process of my eyes being open to this whole part of the body of Christ that I had been completely oblivious to. And through that visit, and then now, of course, actually living here myself, I've come to both see and experience the hardships, prejudice, and often downright injustice that our Palestinian brothers and sisters face on a daily basis, not because of their faith, but because of their ethnicity or national identity. And because this oppression is based on nationality, it's something that Palestinian believers share with their fellow Palestinians of other faiths. And once I realized that it should bother me that Palestinian Christians were being oppressed, I then realized it should bother me that any Palestinian is being oppressed, because God is a God of justice and he cares about all of us as his creatures who bear his image. So now, having lived in Palestine for some time now, I've been given the opportunity and responsibility to help my fellow American believers, and especially my fellow Southern Baptists, learn more about the Palestinian part of the body of Christ. For many people, I'm the only person they know who has a direct connection to Palestine. A lot of people I know are in the same boat I was in as far as their views on Palestinians and the conflict in the Holy Land. And it's both exciting and humbling to be able to graciously walk with people through the same kinds of realizations I had. And the Lord has opened so many doors for me to answer people's questions and share about life here and about the kindness and strength and dignity of the Palestinian people. So that's a bit of my story and my connection to Palestine.
Pastor Hanna, your turn. Thank you so much, Hope.
Thank you, Ben, and grateful for the opportunity to be with you. I born and grew up in Gaza. My parents belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church, but I got to know the Lord in personal way through the only evangelical church in the whole Gaza Strip and the young age, and had the privilege to be called by the same church where I got saved to be the first local pastor for Gaza Baptist. And I did that from 87 to 91, went to Bethlehem Bible College. Then the Lord opened door for me to go to Fuller Seminary. And after I finished, the Lord put in my heart to go back to the same church and join the faculty of Bethlehem Bible College. And we have extension in Gaza as well. So I had the privilege to pastor Gaza Baptist for 12 years, and we continue to serve after we went through the persecution in Gaza. To make the story short, we end up in Jordan, but I continue to go to Gaza 3 times a year. Actually, 10 days before the war started, I was there. And every Sunday, even while I'm in the States, every Sunday we have live Zoom with the church in Gaza. Even as you could imagine, at the time of the war, it's difficult for them to connect. But we have Gazians from around the world who care about Gaza, who care about the Christian community. So every Sunday we have a full service, 8:30 to 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And every other Thursday, we have trauma counseling with people from the Gaza and also from the refugees, Iraqi refugees in Jordan. So we continue to serve. While we in Gaza, of course, we serve the church and the library, which is part of the church. And the church is started by a Southern Baptist, and also the library, which is the only Christian public library, I should say, in the whole Gaza Strip, and also there is a lighthouse school. But of course, in the time of the war, everything changed now, and also we continue to have relief for the Christian community and the wider community as well in some of the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. So we continue to do what we can at this difficult time, even while I'm here. So I just actually came from Jordan, last Wednesday night, came back after spending about 5-6 weeks in Jordan. So again, grateful for the opportunity to be with you and to share and to see what we can do as brothers and sisters, the body of Christ, how to be blessing for the people in Gaza at this difficult time.
Thanks, Pastor Hanna. It's an extra blessing that you're joining us, given the jet lag that I imagine that you're suffering from at the moment. Thanks for that. I also want to point to Hanna's story is in a book as well, and it's a good one. I'd like to recommend it. Hanna, is it Pastor in Gaza or Pastor of Gaza? What's the title of your book?
It's
it's something like that. Look it up, you'll find it.
A pastor from Gaza.
Pastor from Gaza. It's his biography. It's his spiritual journey and the story of his life. So I commend it to our listeners. Well, thanks to each of you. Really deeply appreciate that. Hearing a little bit about your personal connections as Baptists to Palestine is really important background for what we're going to do next, which is look at the resolutions and talk about the resolutions. So I want to share just a few details about this for people who might not have all of the details about what the Southern Baptists did or said about Gaza and just war this summer. The Southern Baptist Convention recently passed resolutions addressing the church's position, the SBC's position on the war in Gaza. And they have been met with both praise and criticism from constituents within the SBC, as well as from the larger evangelical community. Essentially, the first resolution responds to October 7th. There are a series of statements at the beginning, whereas statements about what happened on October 7th. And it responds to those with a series of resolutions statements condemning the acts of Hamas on that day, but also a whole litany of other position statements as well about the campus protests in the United States, about supporting biblical resolutions to the conflict, about a whole range of other things. And then also they stand against any efforts to call on Israel for a ceasefire. So that's the first one. There are a variety of details. I encourage you to go and read it if you haven't already. We'll follow up with this webinar with an email with links to these resolutions and some other resources as well. The second resolution recognizes a history in the Southern Baptist denomination standing for peace through various times of war. There have been historic statements in the SBC about peace, but also aligning itself through that same history with a just war ethic. So quoting the statement, these two quotes from the statement do a good job of summarizing what the statement is doing. So the first one is, whereas Southern Baptists have lamented war as a sorrowful calamity and declared our abhorrence of war, yet we have simultaneously concluded that some things are worth dying for. And if they are worth dying for, they are worth living for. And if they are worth living for, they are worth defending even unto the death. And then dropping down further, if that's the ground, then the resolution is this: resolved that the messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana, June 11 and 12, 2024, affirm the historic Christian principles of the just war tradition. And the statement goes on then there are individual statements for each of the main principles of just war that serve as the main pillars of the just war ethic. That statement does not mention Gaza explicitly, but one of the premises for the conversation that we're having today is that these two statements can be read in connection with each other. Before we start addressing the statements directly, I wonder if, Pastor Hanna, if you would give us, if you would describe for us the situation on the ground in Gaza as we speak, because these resolutions were passed in June. A lot has happened since then. And they didn't pay much attention anyway, if any, really, to the situation on the ground in Gaza. These resolutions didn't. So before we address the resolutions head on, I wonder if you could fill us in a little bit on how things are in Gaza at the moment.
Thank you, Ben. The Christian community in Gaza now, it's about 650 people, I will say. About 200 of them, already left. So left Gaza, went to Egypt, and able to go to other countries. So the remain, it's about 650. Most of them evacuated in two churches, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. Basically, in simple words, people in the churches are tired, exhausted, worried, scared. And really, it's been very difficult for them. And there's really no words to explain or express the pain and the difficulty, the pressure, they're going through. Things is very difficult. For example, a couple of days ago, there was explosion in the church compound, and there's three, civilians from the Christian community been injured, but thank God they are in stable condition. But as you could imagine, people didn't feel safe. Things are very expensive. For example, one single egg, when things are really bad, it's worth about 200. I mean, it costs $2, $2.50, just one single egg. The solar, I was talking to the priest in the Catholic Church, Father Yusuf, and for example, there's a lot of needs. For example, they need solar for the generator to work to dig water from the well in order to provide water for people for daily needs. And solar usually, it's $1 per liter. Now in Gaza, it's about $26, just 1 liter of gasoline. God, by the grace of God, we're able to continue to reach out and to help not only the people in the churches, but also in the wider community. The situation for the people in the churches is much better compared for people outside, but both of them are in the same boat. We're able to reach out to the Christian Gazians who fled to Cairo to help them with relief, food, medicine, and rent. In Gaza, beside the Christian community with helping with hot meals, we're able to provide clean water for drinking in different areas in Gaza, and also bread distribution, hot meals also for the wider community. Sometimes it's really difficult to channel fund, but you do what you can. Because usually people ask how you're able to do that. Basically, we send the fund to the West Bank, and we have a merchant in the West Bank we trust, and who has a partner in Gaza. So when he received our fund in the West Bank, he called his partner, another merchant in Gaza, to deliver the fund to our people in the churches. So this is how we able to do that. And so basically, this is what we try to do at this difficult time. So I hope I answered your questions, but really, it's been difficult. Gaza Baptist Church, for example, there's a lot of damage in the church building. This building, 5 floors, dedicated for the ministry in 2005. But I am not sure if the church building will able to remain standing because the damage is huge. So we need estimation from engineers. Our home in Gaza took my father 10 years to build that home. This is where I grew up, and my children where they grew up, and 2 floors building leveled, completely demolished. And but this is nothing really compare what people going through. Sometimes I feel embarrassed even to mention our home been demolished because, as you know, how many children been killed and how many women been killed, how many civilians. But it just try to mention that to draw a picture what is like, because the infrastructure, the damage, the destruction is unbelievable. So it just we hope this nightmare will end soon, and that people be experienced some stability, in Gaza. So I didn't want to take too much
Thank
time
you.
about this, but yeah.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, and I'll just add from a big picture level, the estimates are getting close to 40,000 people killed during the war. And that does not count people whose bodies have not been recovered from under the rubble. So that number is likely higher. And then tens of thousands, 80, 90,000 injuries. And these aren't scratches and bruises. These are amputations and brain damage and so on, life-altering injuries in many cases. The situation is dire. Let's turn to these resolutions. My question is this for each of the panelists to respond to, and Hannah, we'll send it right back to you to respond first. The question is these resolutions, given your identity as Southern Baptists and your unique background in Palestine, these personal connections that we've just been talking about, how do you respond to these resolutions? How do they strike you? And what would you like people to know about how you're thinking about these resolutions? Pastor Hanna.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ben. If I may just mention in the beginning how important for us as followers of Christ, what is really our priorities, what is really the most important thing for us in this life. Of course, our faith in the Lord, our family, and the ministry that the Lord entrusted us with. And also, to examine our hearts, really, and the motivation, our attitude, and I saw people go too far to this side or too far to the other side, but we can have love in our hearts for both people. I didn't have to go to this far to this side or that far to the other side, but Lord, help me to examine my heart and my motivation, because you are the most important thing for me, for the call you have in my life. When we read the resolution concerning the Southern Baptist, I didn't see, unfortunately, talking about, first I should say, October 7th shouldn't happen. And it's grief our heart as followers of Christ to see that. But in the same time, I didn't see they mentioned about the Israeli occupation concerning, what the Palestinian people went through, like 56 years or so, the occupation of Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And, this is really the root of the conflict, because as long as we just deal with the symptoms of the problem, when a Jew kill a Palestinian or Palestinian kill a Jew, if we just focus about the symptoms, we will continue to go through this bloodshed for generations to come. And the cycle of violence will continue for many generations. So this is why we really need to deal with the root of this conflict. Unfortunately, in this resolution, they didn't show the other side of the coin. They didn't draw the big picture. And as you know, what happened, for example, to the Palestinian in 1948, whereas more than 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. 50 or 55,000 of those were Christian. And for example, my family, my father's side of the family, lost, for example, 67,000 square meters of land in 1948. We documents to approve it. We have documents to approve it, but there is nothing we're able to do about it. So this is the story of many Palestinians, which is not mentioned in this resolution. Another point quickly, this war, is supposed to be between Israel and the militant group Hamas, but I see this war in many different ways against the civilians in Gaza. And as you mentioned, the 40,000, many of those are children and women and civilians. In the beginning of the war, there's about 21 Christian Palestinian civilians been killed, 18 of them in the church compound. One of them was my aunt. And also, if I may mention Ilham, Sister Ilham Farah, she played the piano for Gaza Baptist for many years. And one day she left the church, went to check on her apartment, and she's just 2 streets away from her apartment. The sniper killed, shot her. She left in the street bleeding. She's in her 80s. Very active, and no one was able to help her. Even the ambulance wasn't able to reach out. The neighbor knew her. They saw her in the street, but they're not able to open their doors to pull her in because their life would be in there. So she left in the street bleeding until she died. A few days later, they came, when they have a ceasefire, they came to check on her. And barely they able to identify the body. The only way they're able to identify the body because from the bag she was carrying. So it was very tragic. If I may just mention concerning this resolution, as I was thinking about this war, one of the questions came to mind, Hannah, which side are you on? And it's remind me of Joshua in chapter 5, verse 13 to 15. Joshua was close to Jericho. and he was fighting the Canaanites, and he saw a man coming toward him, and Joshua asked him, "Are you with us or with our enemies?" And he responded, "Neither," and identified him as the commander of the army of the Lord. And Joshua, then he start to bow down and to worship. And I think a better question for us, which side we are on, to ask a better question, are you on the side of the Lord? Are you on the side of the Lord? And the question also come, which side the Lord is on? This is the side of the Lord, as you know, Micah 6:8, to walk humbly before the Lord, to act justly, and to love mercy. And one of the questions came to mind, if Jesus physically, he's among us these days, where he will be. And I think he will be with the hostages, he will be with their families, he will be with the people with a broken hearted, he will be with civilians who lost loved one in both sides. He will be with the children under the rubble, and maybe he's also helping pulling the children from under the rubble. So I love, in the end, I just want to mention these verses, which is mentioned in the resolution, which is Psalm 82, 3-4, because this is what I hear, this is what I see happening in Gaza these difficult days. And when we talk about justice, and this is what minor prophets recommend us in the Old Testament to speak against injustice. The verses, Psalm 82, 3-4, defend the cause of the weak and fatherless, maintain the rights of the poor and oppressed, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And one of the things that's really difficult for me as a Christian Palestinians, when I see sometimes brothers and sisters around the world, in the West especially, and using scripture to, probably they didn't mean that, to use scripture to oppress people who's already been oppressed. And we need to really to be careful and to have compassion and wisdom how to use the scripture to be blessing for others. So my prayer, just God help us all to continue to reflect your love in this difficult time. Help us all wherever we are to continue to carry your presence. And so maybe people see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. Deep appreciation for your words.
Thank you, Ben.
Before Hope jumps in, I want to encourage each of our listeners to think of a question that they would like to ask. It could be a question directed to a particular panelist, or a broader question that could be directed to any of them. But that's my invitation to you while you're listening to Hope. Think of one question that you'd be interested in, and drop it in the chat, because we'll in the Q&A. Because when we're done with these comments, we'd like to have a nice exchange to wrap up today. So, Hope, it's your turn.
Thanks, Ben. When it comes to the SBC resolution on the war in Gaza, I would say that my initial response was disheartened and frustrated, but not very surprised. Given my previous perspective that I explained earlier, there was a time when I would have applauded this resolution without qualification. And even still, there is much that I agree with. My main issues are not so much with what is said, although I do have some issues with what is said, but they're more about what is not said and what those omissions communicate, especially to the Palestinian church and to those whom we are seeking to lead to Christ. But before I get into that, I'll just briefly touch on the other resolution, the one about just war and the pursuit of peace. I actually have hardly any objections to this one, but I find it really ironic that it was passed alongside the one about the war in Gaza. Because if you look at how a just war is defined in the just war resolution, I think you would expect a resolution on the war in Gaza to be much more critical of the modern state of Israel. And I think a strong case could be made that Israel is not carrying out the war in a fully just way. But the Gaza resolution doesn't raise any concerns whatsoever about Israel's actions, and it seems to lay all the blame for any human rights violations, oppression, and injustice on one side and totally absolve the other side. And just to be clear, I do not in any way support Hamas or condone what they've done. I'm simply pointing out that the other side is not entirely blameless when it comes to failing to protect human rights and defend the oppressed and promote justice. And I'm not just talking about since October 7th, but over the past several decades too, even before Hamas existed. And let me just encourage anyone listening, if you have an immediate gut reaction of discomfort or fear whenever I say something that critiques Israel, I totally understand because I've been there. So let me encourage you that it's okay to have questions. It's okay to be open to the fact that there might be things going on that you don't know about. And just also iterate that, I think building relationships with people who are actually being affected in the region is really the best way to learn. But back to the resolution on Gaza, one thing I appreciate about its verbiage is that it does state, quote, that we recognize the dignity and personhood of all people living in the Middle East, end quote. But if you look at what is left out, the veracity of that line seems a bit questionable because some people come out looking more valuable than others. For instance, why does it only reference the, quote, unspeakable atrocities and cruel and inhumane treatment committed by Hamas and say nothing of the heinous acts committed by the Israeli side, some of which Pastor Hannah mentioned? Why are the casualties and hostages on one side numbered, but the horrifyingly greater numbers of casualties and completely displaced people on the other side not even mentioned? Why does it talk about, quote, Palestinians living under the tyranny of this terrorist organization, end quote, and doesn't mention how Palestinians and those married to them, like me, live under Israeli oppression? There's mention of increased, quote, incidents of anti-Semitism, which I always find to be kind of a funny term because technically Arabs are Semites too, right? They're descendants of Shem, which is where the term Semite comes from. But anyway, we absolutely should be against the targeting of Jewish people for any reason. But should we not also be against similar targeting of Muslims, Palestinians, or Arabs? And attacks against people in these groups have also been happening since October 7th. So why is there no mention of that? When we think about what these omissions communicate to Palestinians, we can see how the resolution displays a lack of understanding, empathy, and compassion for the hundreds of thousands, even millions of Palestinians who have been denied freedom for decades and who are suffering in unthinkable ways, and even more so in recent months. And this is hurtful and troubling for Palestinian Christians as well. I think for some reason, American Christians tend to expect Palestinian Christians not to be concerned about the suffering of their fellow Palestinians who are not also Christian. But this isn't how we are in America. On 9/11, weren't we concerned for all the victims and their families because they were our countrymen, regardless of whether or not they were Christians? So why do we seem to criticize or even vilify Palestinians for speaking out against the things that hurt their people, regardless of religion? Why do we expect Palestinian Christians not to grieve what is happening to their Christian and Muslim neighbors? So why does it matter what the resolution communicates to Palestinians? Well, for Palestinian Christians, there are brothers and sisters in Christ. So we should want to be the first to show love to them, not to pour salt on their deep wounds, to borrow Daud Kitab's phrase. And what the resolution communicates to non-Christian Palestinians, which I'll explain in a second, also hurts Palestinian believers because it hinders their work of sharing the gospel. And that's one more line in the resolution that doesn't really seem to hold water. The line about, quote, honoring the difficult ministry of Jewish and Palestinian believers who labor for the gospel, end quote. I'm sure that line was well intended. I'm not questioning anyone's motives here, but the practical repercussions of this resolution do the exact opposite. The difficult ministry of Palestinian believers is not honored. It's made more difficult. To explain why, let me share a little bit of context. As you probably know, Christians are a very small minority among Palestinians who live in Palestine. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is that in Palestine, religion is seen as part of your identity. It's even listed on birth certificates. So most people are either Muslim or Christian, regardless of whether or not they actually believe or practice the tenets of that religion. So among the small minority of those counted as Christians, there is an even smaller minority who are actually what we would call true born-again believers. The rest we call Christians by name. So you have everyone who's considered Christian, which is a relatively small group. Then you have an even smaller group within that who actually attend church. And among that minority, you have an even smaller group who attend evangelical churches. And unfortunately, evangelicals are not always thought very well of among the other branches of Christianity, at least here in West Bank, other branches like Catholic and especially Orthodox. Now, a lot of people here, especially Muslims, equate America with Christianity. So anything the American government does politically is seen more or less as a representation of Christianity. And because America is and has been a strong ally of Israel politically and supports them financially and militarily, then a lot of people think that Christianity does the same. So if you go back to what I said earlier about Palestinians understandably being against the suffering and oppression of their own people, you can see how this view of Christianity as being on the side of the oppressor makes Christianity unpalatable and raises a whole host of stumbling blocks that have to be dismantled before someone is even open to the idea of Christianity being good and true. And even among Christians by name here, evangelicalism gets another huge strike against it when people see so many American evangelicals cheering on Israel with little to no understanding of what Israel is actually doing on a daily basis. So then when we have the largest evangelical denomination in America by far coming out with a resolution like this that ignores both the historic and current plight of the Palestinian people, non-Christian and Christian alike, we now have one more massive stumbling block, one more layer of objections from both Christians by name and Muslims. We now have to explain how it's possible that Jesus absolutely does love and care about the Palestinian people and that he sees their lack of freedom, both physical and for many also spiritual, and he has compassion on them. We have to explain how that is true of Jesus when the people who are his representatives on earth turn a blind eye and show such a lack of understanding and compassion. I was struck by hearing the chair of the SBC Resolutions Committee this year say in an interview that one of the questions they asked when evaluating the submitted resolutions is, quote, will it help us share the gospel with the lost in a more profound way? And while I love that they asked that question, I think that the answer in this case is no. It does not help believers in Palestine share the gospel with the lost all around us. It does the opposite. Not to mention how profoundly discouraging and defeating it is to Palestinian believers. So I would hope going forward that Southern Baptists, both individually and corporately, would really intentionally examine their view of Palestinians and of Israel and humbly ask God to show us if there are places that politics has formed our opinion more than his word. And regardless of the theological view of Israel that is held, because as the resolution rightly mentioned, there is diversity of belief on that issue among Southern Baptists, I hope and pray that we as followers of Christ would want to see the Israeli government be godly in their actions and actually uphold the Judeo-Christian principles that we seem to assume they follow just because they have the name Israel. And that our words and resolutions would reflect that we call them to this godly governing and peace and dignity and freedom. And I pray that we would see the Palestinian people as people deserving of peace and freedom as well, as people of equal dignity with the Jewish people, as the valuable image bearers of God that they are, whom Jesus died for, just as he died for the Jewish people and for us. I hope we become uncomfortable with remaining in a place of ignorance regarding the experiences and needs of the Palestinian people, including our fellow believers. And I hope we take the instructions to weep with those who weep and learn to apply it not just with Israelis, but with Palestinians too. I pray that Southern Baptists would show a deep commitment to pursuing justice, peace, and human flourishing for all people, including both Palestinians and Israelis in the Holy Land. And I pray that American Christians would reflect and not misrepresent the love of Christ to the watching world. So with that, thank you again for joining us today, and I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Amen. Thank you, Hope. deeply appreciate your words. I want to say thank you to Glenn, to Julie, and to Kedrick, because you have taken us up on our invitation to submit questions. Really appreciate it. Oh, and just a second ago, Tom. Thanks, Tom. For the rest of you, again, the invitation stands for you to be submitting questions while we wrap up with our final prepared comments and move into a Q&A. Randy, it's your turn.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm just amazed at the comments Hannah and Hope have made, and it's humbling and a privilege to join in this conversation. Just as a lay person, just kind of rank and file, Southern Baptist who loves God's word and tries to follow Jesus thoughtfully and faithfully, and their words and reference to scripture is just spot on. I mean, and it's great to be a part of this conversation. What I would like to do in my time here, rather than take the current resolutions and kind of parse them, that I agree with this, I don't agree with that, this needs more comment or what have you. I think these resolutions invite a lot of conversation, and I hope people will read them with kind of an open mind, saying, particularly in light of scripture and in light of some of the conversations that we've had here today, what does this lead me to? And to really begin to find ways to engage in conversation. And so what I want to do in my time is to kind of take a look back and say, what have Southern Baptists said about war and peace in the past? And so I did some research, and Southern Baptists are good at saving things. So there's a whole archive of all the resolutions that have been passed over the years, and going back over 100 years, looking for what have they said. And interestingly enough, of the hundreds of topics that are listed in the archives, conversations and resolutions about war and peace are more common than almost anything else. There's only like 4 or 5 other topics that are addressed more frequently than war and peace. And so going back, I pulled out 2 or 3 that I think are particularly relevant to our conversation today. And the first I chose because it talks about, it embodies the aspirations and the feelings of almost all the other resolutions that are passed. And this one was passed at the annual meeting in 1983. And I'll paraphrase for brevity's sake here. But it talks about that the Bible upholds the great ideal of peace and shares the vision of mankind's sword being beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, and calls for God to be at peace with him, with each other, and with ourselves. It goes on talking about Jesus being the Prince of Peace. And then it calls us to Romans chapter 14, where it says, we as followers are to follow after those things that make for peace. And finally, that the biblical criterion for experiencing peace on earth is the realization of justice in human relationships. I think, as I read over and through so many of these resolutions, that is consistent, those sentiments and those aspirations. I looked at another one. I thought it would be interesting to see are there any resolutions that were passed during a time of war? And in fact, there was one passed in May of 1943. So May of 1943, we're in the midst of World War II, the deadliest conflict in history. At this time, the outcome of the war was in no way certain. The tide had not yet turned for America and our allies. Things were tenuous in the Pacific. The invasion of Europe was still more than a year off. But here's what Southern Baptists said at the time, and I think this is extremely relevant to what we're talking about today, and directly impacts some of the comments that were made earlier. And here's what they said. And again, I'll edit for time's sake here. But it says the prosecution of the war, and this is World War II, and again, 1943. The prosecution of the war for the maintenance, perpetuation, and extension of our freedoms may not accomplish its purpose. So the prosecution of the war for freedom may not accomplish its purpose for which it is fought unless just and righteous peace follows the termination of the war. It goes on to say then, and this is amazing. It says, it will be too late to make plans for lasting peace if constructive and comprehensive plans are delayed until the conclusion of the war. So I take those aspirations listed in the first resolution, and I take this call for a just peace to be contemplated and planned for and worked for in the midst of war. And I take that and I lay that over the current resolutions. And when we talk about the resolution for a just war, the first resolution that was passed, here's what it says. And this, again, I'm quoting, and I may edit slightly for time's sake, but it says, we affirm that policymakers' obligation is not discharged once the fighting stops. That wartime leaders must pursue order, justice, and conciliation in the aftermath of war. And this is critical. That war plans that take no heed of war's aftermath are fundamentally unjust. If we're not planning for a just peace at the end of this current war, by definition here in this adopted resolution, says it's not a just war. It says that an otherwise just war that fails to consolidate order, justice, and conciliation in its wake is not a fully just war. I think that's just an amazing statement that we need to look at, and I'll speak to what I think that means here momentarily. If we look at the second the second resolution that was passed, it again, and I thank Hannah for mentioning these citations. It says that we commit, as Southern Baptists, we commit to supporting a biblical solution to the conflict, advocating for principle of justice, mercy, and humility in all actions taken by Israel in its pursuit of a just peace. So going back to Micah 6:8. It further goes on, and Hannah mentioned this, and it's in Psalms and in Isaiah, where it says that the international community must redouble its efforts in support of the nation of Israel toward a just and lasting peace, addressing underlying issues. And that is, again, critical, addressing the underlying issues such as terrorism, human rights violations, and regional instability, consistent with biblical calls to defend the oppressed and promote justice, especially among non-combatants and civilians. And then finally, to recognize the dignity and personhood of all people living in the Middle East. So I think when you take those calls, those are ones that I think, Christians can rally behind. Those are the ones to which I want to cling and to which I want to invite people. Now, in none of the resolutions that I've looked at, either historical or current, have a direct call to action. But I think inherent within these, there is a call to action. And that's where I want to focus. I think that this webinar is as important as it is, and as I hope inviting as it is to people to engage in conversation. What I'm really hoping is that it will stimulate people to want to do something. So what can we do? I believe that, and I'm just going to throw out two ideas. but I believe that God is calling his church. And in these last days, he is calling us to fulfill the Great Commission. He's calling us to be what we say we're about. And so there's two things that I'd like to broach and to put on the table. First is something that we can do immediately, and the second will be something that's longer term. But in the immediate short term, we can plan to go to the church. We can plan to engage with brothers and sisters, and both Hannah and Hope have talked about this, and they mentioned, let's go. We don't understand from our desks and our armchairs in the United States, listening to whatever media sources we choose to engage with. There is so much that we don't understand. In my time in the Middle East, that's one of the things I've come away with is how little I understand. And yet, if we go, which I think that is the Great Commission. I mean, it's not sit and send money, sit and think about it, think and pray about it, sit and pray about it. It's go. And so I want to encourage people to afford themselves the opportunity of going, meeting our brothers and sisters in the land, learning from them. And by the way, we don't need to go with solutions in hand, because I don't think we have solutions, but we need to go to understand so that we can begin to work in partnership with all parties in the land what will make for a just peace. How do we address the underlying issues of the conflict? So I think on the first case, let's go. Let's go with humility. Let's go wanting to learn. Let's go with the idea that we can bring back from our brothers and sisters so much knowledge and wisdom about living with your enemy, loving your enemy, praying for those who persecute you, engaging in the work of reconciliation to which we're all called. So the first thing is, let's go. The second thing I would like to suggest is that we plan for a longer term. This war will end at some point. I don't know when, but when it does, someone will rebuild. Someone will rebuild Gaza. And my question to the church, and I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be prophetic, but I think God is asking his church, who will rebuild my church? Who will take care of my sheep? And those who are currently called, our brothers and sisters who are at the Gaza church or at these other churches, who will rebuild this tiny, tiny community? 650 people out of 2.2 million. Who will rebuild? Who will give them a place to go, to worship, a place to live, a place from which to reach out to their community? Who will put this lamp on a lampstand again? I would hate to think that we would say, well, that will be the Gulf states, the nations will have to come, or that will be an NGO, or that will be the UN. I would hate to think that that's who we are going to allow to do this. I do not want to stand before the Lord and say, it was easier to let somebody else do it. They had the money, they had the time, whatever. I think he's calling the church. And as Southern Baptists, we have a particular call. We started the Gaza Baptist Church. We started the hospital that many still refer to as the Baptist Hospital, even though it's under Anglican management now. We started these schools in churches in the West Bank, in Nazareth, and so forth. And the Southern Baptists have been there for well over 100 years. And I think it's time we think about going back. So I just want to think, if we are a Great Commission people, we have an opportunity in this land that is so important to us and important to God. And I just want to encourage us to look at that. So that's, I think I'll wrap up. I know we're running up against time. I'll wrap up with that. But if if that piques someone's curiosity, I encourage as a result of this that we talk about, we engage, we invite additional conversation. But specifically, I invite people to go to the land. And I'm currently working on a couple of trips with local pastors here in Tennessee. Somebody reach out if you think you want to go. I mean, we'll make room. There are others within the NEMI organization who are far more qualified than I. We can make that happen, but people, let's not just think about this. Let's pray earnestly, urgently, and let's be Great Commission people, and let's go. I think that's the call. Ben, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Randy. And thanks to all of you. Again, this is the moment where if we were in person, I would lead our listeners in expressing their gratitude. So I'm just going to say it for them. Thank you so much for the contributions that you've made to this conversation, each of you. Hope, Randy, Hannah. We take them as a gift. Yeah, I see someone found the applause emoji. Thanks. Let's dive into some of these questions. We have a few minutes. I'm going to summarize and synthesize a few of them. There's an anonymous attendee who asks a question. I'm going to read this one and then combine it with a couple of others as well. The anonymous attendee says, how can I, as a young person in a big SBC church, advocate for the Palestinian people when it feels like a lot, not all, but a lot of the leaders and people around me don't care to look any deeper than the surface toward Gaza and even the West Bank? So that's a heartfelt question. I'm going to put it in relationship with Tim's question, which is, what are some ideas for starting or engaging in conversation? And a very similar question from Kedrick. These types of conversations are difficult to have with people who see that Israel can do no wrong when things are relatively stable. How can we, at a time of war, have these conversations when hearts seem to become harder? So this is a question about, we're surrounded by people who don't care or who don't understand or whose hearts are hard as we perceive it. How can we start conversation? How can we engage within a community like that? And I will leave that for any of our panelists who would like to respond.
Well, if nobody's going to jump in, I'm simply going to
go for
it. To reiterate my invitation. It's very difficult from here to understand and to gain a different perspective. We live in echo chambers. We tend to flock with birds similar to ourselves. I think one of the real critical things, and the thing that changed my mind, was going and engaging and being introduced to the church in Israel, which, many people don't understand. 90% of the church in the Promised Land, 90% of the people are Palestinian. And so let's go and meet with people on both sides of the separation wall. And let's engage and talk with them. And let's not try to, as Westerners, provide all the answers. Because I honestly think that, the more I go and the more I hear, the less I understand, but the more I need my brothers and sisters over there to help me, to educate me, to soften my heart toward all sides and everything that's going on over there. So I invite people, let's go to the source and let's learn from them.
Thanks, Randy.
I'll just jump in
what
too.
Southern Baptist doesn't want to go to the Holy Land? That's everybody wants to go. So that should be an easy ask. So let's anyway, that's
great. Thanks, Randy. Hope?
Yeah, I'll just jump in too. Yeah, I really appreciate what Randy said. I think as you're thinking of how to help other people see something that they're not seeing, um, I think it's helpful to think about what it was for you that helped you understand. Um, Especially, I think most of us, I would guess, in the American church, there was a point in time where we learned about the Palestinian church. I don't think we all just kind of, you know, automatically have this knowledge. And so, um, thinking back to what it was for you that helped you see and understand, or if you, shifted views, kind of like I shared what happened with me, um, and then help other people have the opportunity to have those kinds of experiences. So, like for me, it was hearing from an actual Palestinian believer. So again, just going off what Randy said, like finding ways that you can invite people into situations where they see and hear from a real person, with a with somebody that they can name and see their story and ask questions to and hear from them. Um, I think that's really the best way to do it. And also, if I can just mention just a couple of resources too, as you're seeking to start conversations, I think it's helpful to try to become as knowledgeable as you can, um, about the region in general too, and the history of the region. That helps you, be more informed, as you are having conversations with people. And so, just a couple of things. There's a documentary called Mayor. It's about the Christian mayor of Ramallah, which is in West Bank. That's one thing a lot of people don't realize, is that there are several cities in West Bank that have Christian mayors and actually legally have to have a Christian mayor. Bethlehem is one, Ramallah is one. So anyway, there's a documentary is actually made by an American Jewish filmmaker who followed around the mayor, the Christian mayor of Ramallah, for I think it was a couple of years. I want to say 2017 to 2019, maybe. And so anyway, that's an excellent film, to really give people an understanding of kind of what life is like, at least in West Bank. And then also there's a book called Enemies and Neighbors, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel from 1917 to 2017 by Ian Black. I'm actually currently reading it. I'm not all the way through. I'm most of the way through. It's not a Christian book. It's just a regular history of 1917 to 2017 in this land. But I found it to be really, really helpful and balanced, in understanding a lot of the nuances of the history of the last 100 years. So if you're wanting to learn more, I would recommend that book to you as well. But I think, again, just to reiterate, if you can connect with actual Palestinian believers and Israeli believers, that's really helpful in opening people's eyes, I think.
Thanks,
Yeah, and
Hope.
I would make one more comment. And I think when we're engaging in conversation or wanting to engage in conversation, I think one of the really critical points to remember is that this is an extremely complex situation, and it's not binary. And I think so often we want to create black, white, right, wrong, yes, no. And the truth doesn't live there. The truth in this case, there's a lot to consider, and there are things about which we can agree and things about which we can disagree. I think that we should fight against the notion of a dichotomous answer, and try to hold a much larger truth than that. And it's a real challenge, but I think that's one of the things that if there's going to be constructive dialogue, that's one of the things that needs to happen.
Thanks, Randy. Hope, would you restate the title of the book that you mentioned for everyone?
Yes, it's called Enemies and Neighbors, Arabs and
Enemies and
Jews.
Neighbors.
Yeah, Enemies and Neighbors is the main title. Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel from 1917 to 2017. And it's by Ian Black, Ian Black.
Thank you. Hannah, is there anything you'd like to add on this question?
Just, to emphasize what Randy and Hope mentioned, people who come to visit Palestine, Israel in person, their life never been the same. So it will be a big change in the life of many people when they come and visit. So I encourage that to connect with the living stones, with the Christian Palestinians to see what's really happening on the ground. Second, I think when people who hear a live testimony, like when you share with your pastor or with your leaders, like my relative or my in-laws, Christians in Gaza, experience this or experience that. So this become more real to the people you connect with in the West when you share with them about what is your community overseas going through. And I think, to have also resources, it's very important, like Hope mentioned, uh, to find ways to help people to see the other side of the coin, to draw the big picture and not to, and, to emphasize the idea, it's more we can have love for both and we can be blessing for both. We not like more like in this side or that side, but let us be on the side of the Lord. What is the heart of God in this situation? And I think maybe, hopefully, that will help people start to rethink and to evaluate the situation, hopefully, in a better way.
Thank you so much. There's another question that I want to ask too, and it's I'm not exactly quite sure how to be precise with it, but the idea behind two of the questions is about why the American church is the way that it is. And one of them put it as, why is the American church silent on Gaza? And the other church said, why is it so hard to have these conversations? Is the church captive to a Christian Zionist theology? So I wanted to put that out there. Again, I think maybe this is for any, not everyone needs to respond, but if there's one of you who could take us forward into that conversation, that would be wonderful.
I think one of the things been what the horrible things the Jewish people went through with the horrible Holocaust, and how the church in the West at that time responded in general, not in the way it should. And that, I think, created guilt in the West concerning what happened. And I think in some ways, at least, the Palestinians are paying the price of what's happening even at that time, and they create sympathy, concerning the Jewish people. And we should, of course, what's happened with the Holocaust is horrible, and it shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, a lot of times people forgot to see also what the Palestinian went through, because even when the Jewish people start to come back in the 20s and in the 30s and in the 40s back to the land, the Palestinian not really against the Jewish people try to find a shelter, but they against the Zionists who came with the previous plan to take more and more land. So what happened in history created that gap, and unfortunately, people start to focus and to emphasize in one side. And also, as you know, the theological teaching, which is emphasize more one side about the Jewish people. And I think one of the things which has helped us as evangelical or as Christians to see the Old Testament through the eyes of Christ, to see the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. And I think that will make a big difference. And this is where we have the difference between dispensations and non-dispensationalists, as you know. So there is a number of issues contribute to what we are seeing now among especially evangelicals in the West. And a lot of work, but we need to see how we could help in this kind of situation.
Yeah,
Thanks
I
so
think,
much.
Ben,
Oh, go ahead.
one of the other things that we can do is, I encourage people who want to begin a conversation in the church to reach out to organizations like Mimi and say, and Hope brought this up, is there a Palestinian voice, either virtually or in person, who could come speak? And I think there are resources, and Mimi may be able to help identify those and facilitate some of those conversations that for Hope and for me and for many others were so important and impactful in terms of forming our understanding of the situation and may be able to help others do that.
Thank you so much to each of you. From the bottom to the top of our hearts, your contributions to our conversation have been so valuable. For our attendees, there is a button across the bottom of your Zoom window. If you would find the button that says reactions and just pick the reaction that best expresses how you're feeling towards our panelists right now and share it. I just want to say thank you. And it looks like our panelists are really appreciative of your contribution as well. For all of you who've joined us, there were a couple of other questions. There's clearly in these questions and some of the others expression of interest in ways to stay engaged. And so I invite you to, take up the challenges and invitations you've heard from these panelists. I also invite you to engage with the network of evangelicals for the Middle East. We're a young, small, but growing organization, and we see ourselves as serving a role that is pretty unique when you look at the lay of the land in terms of organizations, Christian organizations that are out there seeking to educate the church and help the church to learn about what's happening in Israel and Palestine and the broader Middle East. We have a curriculum that's about to launch. We invite you to use in your church, to consider. There's an opportunity to come and join us in person in Montecito, California for our annual gathering this December. I hear Southern California is nice in December. Consider joining us there. And please consider donating. We can use all of the help, and we appreciate new friends being a part of the NIMI community. There are links for all of these opportunities that we just dropped in the chat, so those are good next steps. We also, finally, I'll say, if you're interested in knowing about future events like this one, sign up for the NIMI newsletter, and there's a link in the chat for that as well. So that would be a good way to just make sure that you find out more about the curriculum when those details are out, whether you find out about the retreat, and that you find out about our future conversations online. And again, I want to say thanks to our panelists and to all of you for joining us today. It's been a joy, and go and be blessed. We will leave this event up for just a few minutes. If you need to capture some of these links from the chat, you can do that. We will also try to include them in an email follow-up to this event.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Hope.
Hannah, it's so good. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Hannah.
And
Thank
Hope,
you, Randy.
hopefully we'll connect soon virtually, but hopefully we will see you in the land at some point, inshallah.
Yes, inshallah.